Lourdes ARANDA, you are what is called the Sherpa for the Mexican presence of the G20, so you have a very important role. But let me ask you a more general question about the presence of, I don't know whether to use the phrase emerging markets or emerging markets or whatever, but you know what I mean. Mexico and other countries that haven't been in the G7, haven't been in the G8, are now in the G20. Why shouldn't they also have a greater presence in other international gatherings, such as the UN Security Council, and so on, the World Bank, IMF?
I think part of what we have been fighting those emerging countries in the G20 is precisely that, to have not only more spaces, but more decision-making capacity. And those were part of the fundamentals of the original moment when the G20 at the leaders level was created, because it was a kind of trade-off. In that moment, the crisis didn't come as it had been, as they traditionally had come from developing countries. It came from the developed world. And it was a realization that emerging economies had a bigger say and a bigger influence on world economics. And precisely, well, there's different degree of influence of different emerging economies. Of course, we're talking about China and the capacity of China's economy to also affect the rest of the world. Probably one of the other emerging countries by itself doesn't have that full capacity, but all in all, the emerging economies have a much more larger impact in global economy. So that's when it was decided, I think since the first summit in Washington, that countries should have bigger participation in the international fora, but basically in the economic and financial fora. Major voting rights in the IMF, major participation in the World Bank. At that moment there was what it was called the Financial Stability, it was a kind of a very informal organization, I don't remember. And now it's the FSB, the Financial Stability Board. And at the moment, there was no emerging economy participating in it.
Mexico had a candidate for the IMF when Dominique Strauss-Kahn stepped down, ready to run for the French presidency. You had a candidate,
yes,
and yet he didn't seem to get any support. Was that because of the weighted structure of voting in the IMF, that it went from a French man to a French woman?
Yes, I mean, we were a little bit frustrated as Mexico because it had already been stated in the four previous declarations for the G20 that we were going to look for the best candidate, woman or man, for the IMF or the World Bank. It didn't matter the country, but it was going to be the best candidate from all the world. So Mexico proposed, I think, an excellent candidate. And we do believe Mrs. Lagarde, who finally got the job, it's a magnificent candidate. I personally believe that being a woman, I'm very happy, but the issue of having another European director, because there's such a tradition that it should be French or European, it's really something which, at least I think it's like a slap in the face for the emerging countries, which if we're working towards being a little bit more equal and having a bigger say in international financial institutions, this was the first moment where we could show it.
Yes.
But what happens with the Europeans, the first thing they do, they present a candidate. And that's a little bit of contradiction you have when you are trying to work in a coordinated fashion and everybody has to give a little bit of its rights. Well, suddenly you realize you don't want to give that much, but you want the other ones to give more.
Well, let me ask you a final question then. I mean, if you look at the architecture now of the global organizations, the World Bank, IMF, the UN, that architecture was constructed after the Second World War. Well, that's a long time ago.
Well,
how long do you expect this system to remain before there is a more balanced approach?
Well, I think it has to be in this very moment, because I insist, if we're talking about everybody has to take a little bit of responsibility over the world crisis, you have to have also the right to vote on the decision making. And it cannot be very much for very much time that we have the same structure that we got after 45. And if you look at the division of power in economic terms, let's not go into political terms because that will be the Security Council. I mean, it's completely changed. So at least Mexico will keep on insisting that we have to have much more voting rights, much more, well, a larger voice in these organizations. And this morning when we were talking about if the G20, they're all who should be there or others shouldn't be there. Well, for the time being, probably they are all that should be there. This group, the G20 at a minister's level was put in place around '96. So the numbers were different in that moment than what it is. Right now, maybe it should reflect another configuration, but it will take time for the G20 to maybe change. But I think, I mean, that's the point of this. Emerging countries have a larger voice, they have a larger influence, and we will keep on fighting for it. But the G20 is not only emerging against develop. I think the core of the G20 is larger cooperation among everybody. Because maybe in some issues, emerging countries have the same position among themselves. But in some issues, and I can tell you in the case of Mexico, we're much closer to Canada, to Australia, or maybe to the UK. In other cases, maybe to the US. And in other cases, we're completely separate from them. So it's much of a case-by-case issue.
Indeed. Lourdes Aranda, thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. And I was very happy to be invited to this conference. It was a great honor, and I also learned a lot.
Mil gracias.
Thank you.